Well, that was a rough night, wasn't it, guys? If you're an Indian fight fan and you were excited as I was to watch Anshul Jubli fight at UFC 294, you had your hopes tugged around in different directions. For those first 2 rounds, it looked like Anshul Jubli really was as good as we thought he could be, and even better. He showed an incredible game plan against Money Mike Breeden, and now we know, looking back at the judges' scorecards, all of the judges scored Anshul Jubli those first 2 rounds. So if he could just find a way to get through that 3rd round, he would have taken a unanimous decision. But we know what happened. I mean, these things happen in MMA, right? Got caught with a right hook. Money Mike Breeden just started channeling this really deep energy that I don't know if Anshul Jubli knew what to do with it. We don't know exactly what was going through Jubli's head. It seemed like he was a little bit frozen and taken aback by the energy and passion of Mike Breeden. I'd be really curious to hear eventually, and I'm sure we'll get this eventually from some interview, but just to hear what his thoughts were in that 3rd round and to hear what was going on in his head when Money Mike Breeden just turned into this animal. It was a really impressive performance from Mike Breeden to rally and realized that if he didn't win this fight by stoppage, he would probably be cut from the UFC. So props to a very tough Mike Breeden on winning the fight. And also we have to give a lot of respect to Anshul Jubli for the incredible performance that he showed us through 2 rounds. He really deserves a lot of credit, and I think a lot of that is getting overshadowed by the knockout loss. But if you're an Indian fight fan, I'm going to tell you some words that you may not want to hear. So take this with a grain of salt, but the next couple years could be very, very difficult years to be an Indian MMA fan. I'm not saying that Anshul Jubli is going to have a rough stretch or get cut. I'm not saying any of that. But what I am saying is don't expect the first fighter from India to sign with the UFC to go undefeated and win a belt. I think it may take a little bit longer than that. For me, I've been around the sport long enough to see the progression of a couple different countries sending their fighters to the UFC and kind of develop from the ground up. For India, they've still got a long ways to go before they're filling the UFC roster with elite fighters and challenging for a belt. And that's really okay because MMA skill takes a long time to develop, at least on a countrywide level. And India right now just doesn't really have the infrastructure and the long history of producing high-level fighters. And that's totally okay because they're on their way to do just that. But here's an example. I've been around in this sport long enough to remember what Chinese talent was like a decade ago. And at first they had signed this guy named Zhang Tiechun to the UFC. He won his UFC debut by guillotine, and a lot of people were excited. Could Zhang Tiechun eventually challenge for a belt? Is he going to be this Chinese star? And then you know what happened? He went 0-3 in his next 3 fights and was cut from the UFC. Over the next couple years, the UFC tried to sign different Chinese fighters. They even held a Ultimate Fighter season just for China, and really none of those fighters amounted to anything in the UFC. Eventually, they signed Li Jingliang, and then once they actually decided to go to China and hold an event, about that time, there was some talent like Yan Xiaonan, Song Yadong, eventually Zhang Wei Li that they're able to bring in, and then the results started to show. But it was like 8 years in between the first Chinese fighter and when I really started to feel like there could maybe be some fighters that could be ranked and challenge for a belt, which now, today, we have a Chinese champion and several fighters who are ranked in the top 10. But to be honest, this is normal for MMA coming up through a country. If I'm just totally honest, what I think we'll see the next couple years is we'll see some Indian fighters, some with more talent than others, but Indian fighters being signed to the UFC, and a lot of them are probably going to have mixed results. Some of them may do a little bit better, but others may totally wash out. And for a lot of Indian fight fans, this is going to be very, very discouraging. Here's what's happening in that process. Indian athletes are really good athletes, and they have a lot of amazing skills like wrestling and boxing. A lot of these fighters are coming from these backgrounds and testing themselves in the UFC. What really needs to happen is there first needs to be an infrastructure of elite gyms built up in India where fighters can stay and train at home. And right now that just doesn't exist, right? A lot of these Indian fighters are going to Soma Fight Club in Bali. A couple of them here spread out through India, but for the most part, there's not a lot of high-level gyms in India. If you look at China, there's a couple gyms that are starting more and more to develop into higher level gyms, much better than it was 10 years ago. So that's not there. There's also not really like a full rounded out infrastructure of high quality MMA promotions that are consistently producing high level Indian talent. Matrix Fight Night is pretty much carrying most of Indian MMA on its back. And I know there's a lot of other promotions developing at the amateur level and at the lower level, and that's great, but it's really Matrix Fight Night or nothing, at least in India. Otherwise, fighters have to go to other promotions and countries around the world to compete. And the other thing that's happening when Indian fighters are going to the UFC and losing fights, what's happening is that they're figuring out our Indian background of martial arts and sport and athleticism have given us enough tools to be able to make it to the UFC, but at least to get to that next level, what kind of things do we need to fill into the gaps? What kind of things do we need to supplement into our training? These are the things that are going to help Indian MMA improve. These are the things that are going to help gyms get better and better and better in India. And eventually, I promise you, they will turn that corner. And who's to say Anshul Jubli could figure some things out, make a run, and win the belt in 2026? Who's to say that can't happen? That would be amazing. I would be super pumped about that. But I'm just saying, for Indian fight fans, the next couple years could be a little bit challenging, but I promise you, if you stick through it, if you keep supporting your fighters, you don't turn your back on them when they lose fights, you don't unfollow them on social media, but just keep supporting them, stay in their corner, that's going to fuel them even more to make it to that next level. I'm convinced, as much as Dana White or anybody, that India is going to be a powerhouse someday in the UFC. I know that we're going to have an Indian UFC champion someday. We'll probably have something like a PI and eventually dozens of Indian fighters in the UFC at the same time. But we have to build up to that point. We have to figure out what are we lacking and fill in a lot of these holes. Stick by your favorite Indian fighters and give them your full support. And I promise you, we'll see the light of day.